Welcome to Meeple University's How to Play Euphoria, Build a Better Dystopia. In Euphoria, 2 to 6 players play the role of leaders of a resistance movement against the dystopian society in which you live. Players will be placing their allied workers, represented by these coloured dice, onto action spots to gain resources and commodities and to take actions which spread authority throughout the land. All players begin the game with 10 authority stars, and the primary aim of the game is to get all of your stars onto the board or onto cards. The first player to place all of their stars onto the board or onto cards wins the game. To set up the main board, first go to each of these tunnel tracks. Place a minor meeple on the start space, and an unavailable action token on the end space. Repeat this for all 3 tunnels. In the allegiance tracks, take a diamond token, place it on the start space, and take the 2 corresponding circles and place them near the edge of the board. Repeating this for all 4 tracks. Then, on the 4 star-shaped territories, take these X tokens and block out as many spaces as you need until there are as many open spaces as there are players in the game. This would be a 4-player setup. Then take the 7 piles of resources and commodities and place them in open spaces on the board near where you obtain them. The board leaves you space to do this, although you can put the components off board if you prefer less clutter. Shuffle the artifact cards and place them next to the board. Next, shuffle the market tiles and place one face down into each of these 6 locations on the board. Put the rest back in the box as they won't be used. Each player then takes all the components in his or her player colour. A multiplier board, 10 stars, 4 dice, 2 of which are placed down here near the worker activation tank, a heart which is placed on the 1 space of the morale track, and a head which is placed on the +3 space of the intelligence track. Shuffle and deal each player one of these reference cards, which also doubles as an ethical dilemma card. They're all slightly different, so this should be randomized. Next, shuffle and deal each player 4 recruit cards, face down, leaving the rest in a face down pile next to the board. The players look through their cards, choose 2 to keep, and choose 2 to discard, which are discarded face down. Then, of the 2 that the players are keeping, each player chooses 1 to play face up and 1 to leave face down. All players make this revelation simultaneously. I'll talk more about these recruit cards and give you the information that you need to make this choice later in the video. Finally, all players roll the 2 dice in their possession, and whoever has the highest total goes first. Euphoria is a continuous worker placement game. On your turn, you'll either place a die onto the board and perform the action of that space, or retrieve some or all of your dice from the board, taking no other action that turn, but readying yourself to take actions on future turns. Dice that have been placed on the board are always left there until they are either retrieved by choice or bumped back by some other effect of the game. On your turn, you can place 1 die onto the board, immediately performing the action associated with that space. Alternatively, if you start your turn with more than 1 die showing the same number, you'll be able to place all of those dice on the same turn, placing and resolving one action before then placing and resolving the other action. You can only do this if you start your turn with those matching dice. If through some action you obtain another matching die during the turn, you will not be able to place that one. There are 4 different types of action spaces on the board, and the way you interact with each of them varies. The first type of space, looking like this, is the commodity space. It has a large area for dice and a thick grey border. These spaces can be occupied by any number of dice, including multiple dice from the same player, and it is the only type of action space where the number showing on the face of the die has any influence on play. There are 4 different commodity spaces on the board, each corresponding to a different commodity. The second type of action space is called a temporary action space, and they look like this, with space for one die and with a dotted grey outline around it. Any player may place any die of any number into this slot in order to perform the action. If the space is occupied by another player's die, it can still be used. A player simply bumps the die out of its slot and then performs the action. The player who owns the bumped die takes it back into his or her supply and re-rolls it, which I'll talk about later. You can even bump your own dice out of these action spaces to both take the action and retrieve one of your dice in one action. The third type of action space is called an exclusive action space. It looks like the temporary action spaces, except that the border has a colour. It is not grey. These spaces function like the temporary action spaces in terms of occupying and bumping workers out. However, it may only be used by a player who has a face-up recruit card of the matching colour and allegiance. In this case, it's a yellow Euphorian space, and so green could use it because of this yellow Euphorian face-up recruit. The fourth and final type of action space is the construction site, which is shown here next to the market tile. These have room for one die each, depict a resource in the middle, and have a solid grey border. Any player may occupy one of these spaces if he or she pays the resource that is covered up. Players cannot bump each other out of these action spaces. However, players can choose to retrieve their dice if they wish, or once this market has been constructed, which I'll talk about later, all players will get their dice back from those slots. There are 4 of these spaces next to each of the 6 market tiles on the board. Anytime a player gets a die back from the board, whether it's by choosing to retrieve workers, gaining new workers, or being bumped out of an action space by another player, the player rolls the dice that were just retrieved without touching any dice that are already in the player's supply. The player must then perform a knowledge check every time this happens. To perform a knowledge check, add up the sum of the numbers on the dice that are off-board, ignoring any on-board dice, and then add it to the modifier on the knowledge track. So for the green player here, it's 7 showing on the dice, plus 3 from the track is 10. As long as the player has 15 or less, nothing else happens. If, when performing the knowledge check, the total is greater than or equal to 16, your workers are too intelligent. They realise that they're a part of the machine, and you immediately lose one of your workers. Take the worker with the highest number of pips showing and return it to the main supply. You must perform this knowledge check every time you take any workers back from the board. This means that the more workers you have, the less frequently you'll have to retrieve your workers, but the more carefully you'll have to manage those workers to prevent them from getting too intelligent. If, after performing the knowledge check and losing a worker, you still exceed 16, you do not have to lose a second worker. You only lose one worker through knowledge checks at a time. While we're looking at this section of the board, I'll also talk about the morale track. You'll be moving up or down the morale track during the game, and it represents your maximum hand size for artifact cards. Artifact cards are a good way of getting stars onto the board, particularly towards the end of the game. If at any point you lose morale and drop below your current hand size, you must discard artifact cards until you meet your hand limit. You choose which of your artifacts to discard, and you can draw above your hand limit as long as you immediately discard down to it. If on your turn you have no dice to place, or you don't wish to place dice that you have, you may perform the retrieval action. Take any or all of your dice back from the main board and immediately roll them together and perform a knowledge check, losing workers if necessary. Then take one of the two choices associated with the retrieval action. Either pay a food or a cloud back to the supply in order to gain 2 morale, or pay nothing and lose 1 morale. If you only have 1 morale at the start of your turn, you don't lose anything. So, in summary, on your turn you'll take 1 die from your supply and place it into an action space, immediately performing that action. Or, if you had multiple dice showing the same number, you can then perform additional actions. Any dice that you bump out of an action space are immediately returned to their owner, who performs a knowledge check. Once you've run out of dice, or if you no longer wish to place dice, you may forego your normal action to perform the retrieval step. Take back any or all dice, roll them to perform a knowledge check, and then pay resources to gain morale or pay no resources to lose morale. Play will continue clockwise around the table in this manner, with players taking 1 action or retrieving their workers until somebody has won the game. There is a third once-off action related to this card, which a player can take instead of the other actions on his or her turn, but I'll talk about that later in the video. Next, we'll talk about all of the different action spaces and what they do. First, we'll talk about the 4 commodity areas. Each of the commodity areas behaves in the same way. When a player places a die in the commodity area, he or she adds up the total sum of all dice in that area from all players, and then consults this table to determine what benefits are gained. Anything that is gained is shown in a white circle. So by placing this 3, the player would gain 1 water and can see the symbol of the sub-Tarrant allegiance. This means you move the allegiance marker on that corresponding track 1 step. And there is one of these on each of the 4 commodity tracks. I'll talk about what the different things on this track mean later in the video. When a player places another die and gets into the 5 to 8 section, he or she gains 1 commodity and, if possible, loses 1 intelligence on the knowledge track. If a player is in the 9 or plus section, he or she gains 2 commodities and, if possible, moves up 1 on the knowledge track. If a commodity track instructs a player to gain or lose knowledge, but the player is at the edge of the track, the player simply does not take that effect. The worker activation tank is a place for players to gain new worker dice to use. The player takes one of these 2 spots, pays the cost shown in the grey square, and then gains the benefits shown in the white circles. So on this side, the player pays 3 energy to lose 2 knowledge and takes a new worker, which is immediately rolled and a knowledge check performed. On this side, a player pays 3 water to gain 2 morale and gain a new worker, again performing a knowledge check. If the player is at the end of the knowledge or morale track, he or she can still take this action without gaining that extra benefit. At the 3 tunnel spaces on the board, a player may place a die, spend the commodity shown in the grey square, in this case an energy, and then gain one of the two benefits shown, either a resource, in this case gold, or an artifact card drawn from the top of the pack. Remember that a player must have sufficient morale to hold all of his or her artifact cards. Then advance the miner meeple one space down the tunnel. There are two global effects which will be unlocked as the miner moves down the track. When the miner enters the 6th space of each tunnel, it will hit this icon here, and all players who have a face-down recruit card matching the allegiance of that tunnel can immediately flip that card over. Recruit cards come with a bonus action which a player can use, and so the player will now have access to that other action. Then, when the miner reaches the end of the tunnel, remove this token from that slot. This action space now becomes available. Recall that this is an exclusive action space which can only be used by players who have a face-up recruit matching that allegiance. It is a simple action space, and to use these end of tunnel actions, simply place the die and then take the commodities shown in the white circle. The construction site spaces come with no immediate action. The player simply pays the relevant resource and then places a die on that space, leaving it there until the construction is complete. Multiple players can contribute to the same market. Once a number of construction site spaces on a specific market are filled, based on this table here, so 2 spaces in a 2 to 3 player game, 3 spaces in a 4 player game, and all 4 spaces in a 5 to 6 player game, that market is considered built, and the following steps immediately take place. First, flip the market tile over. Then push it to the left, covering the construction site spaces, bumping all of these dice back to their owners, who then perform a knowledge check, and revealing this new market space. Then, any players who had 1 or more dice on that construction site immediately place a star on the market. Once a market has been revealed, it reveals a new cost in grey squares, which is associated with the newly revealed action, and it reveals a penalty shown at the bottom. This penalty will constantly apply to any player who does not have a star on this market. And because there can be up to 6 markets in the game, if you don't invest in building these markets, you can be subject to a number of penalties at the same time during the game. The penalties associated with not having a star on a market are not once-off penalties. They're small penalties which exist in perpetuity for as long as the player does not have a star. For example, always gaining knowledge when placing stars, or always losing resources or commodities when rolling a certain type of number. Because of the nature of these penalties, players need to make sure that they keep track of their own penalties and follow the rules associated with them. Because particularly in a game with a lot of players, it can be difficult for your opponents to keep track of exactly which penalties you're meant to be suffering. The next sort of action space is the artifact market, which is shown in a hexagon, and there is one associated with each of the 4 allegiances. When a player places a worker in this space, he or she discards any 3 artifact cards, or any 2 matching artifact cards. Then the player places a star in that allegiance's territory, either onto an empty space on the star-shaped territory, or onto a constructed market in that allegiance which doesn't already have the player's star. Once a player has placed a star in this manner, he or she will no longer be subject to the penalty for that market. A player may only have 1 star on each constructed territory, but may have as many stars as desired in the star-shaped territory. Finally, advance the allegiance track for that allegiance one space. The next type of action space is the constructed market, which works very similarly. The player places a die, spends the cost shown in the grey squares, and then advances the corresponding allegiance track one space, and places a star in the star-shaped territory for that allegiance. Note that unlike the artifact market, a player cannot place a star on a constructed market in this manner. If the territory has run out of space for stars, you can still perform either of these actions, but will only gain the allegiance track benefit. The final type of action space is the Icarite Lounge, and there are 3 of these where players can go to trade resources and commodities. At the Sky Lounge, a player trades 1 cloud and then one of the other 3 basic commodity types in order to move 1 step up the Icarus allegiance track, and any 2 resources, which are the bricks, gold or stone. To use the breeze bar, the player spends a cloud and one of the other resources in order to move up the Icarus track and gain 2 artifact cards. To use the Nimbus Loft, a player spends any 3 resources, returning them to the supply, to move 1 step up the Icarus track and place a star in the Icarite star-shaped territory. Next, I'll talk about the allegiance track. There is 1 track for each of the 4 allegiances in the game, and you'll move this marker up whenever you get that allegiance's icon in a white circle as part of an action. There are 4 different effects that will be triggered during the game as the allegiance markers move into these sections. When the allegiance marker enters this first section, it makes the commodity section for that allegiance more powerful. Take the corresponding commodity token and place it here to remind yourself of this. From this point forward, any player who has a face-up recruit matching that allegiance gets 1 extra commodity when visiting the commodity area. So for placing a 1 to 4, the green player would only get 1 food, but the purple player would get 2, because the purple player has a face-up Wastelander recruit. When entering the second zone for any allegiance except Icarus, it will make the tunnels higher yielding. Place the corresponding tunnel token on here to remind you of this fact. From that point forward, any player who has a face-up recruit matching that allegiance, when visiting the tunnel, can take both benefits instead of just 1. So in this case, purple could spend 1 food to gain a brick and an artifact card, as well as advancing the miner. For the Icarite territory, which has no tunnel, when you reach the second region, take this token and place it near the star-shaped territory. From this point forward, any time a player who has an Icarite recruit face up places a star in the Icarite territory, he or she also gains 1 artifact card. When an allegiance track enters the third section, any player with a face-down recruit card matching that allegiance may immediately flip it face up. Remember that players can also do this by advancing a miner to the 6th space of a mine track. However, because the Icarus territory has no mine, this is the only way to flip over face-down Icarus recruits. Finally, when an allegiance track reaches the star at the end of the track, all players may place a star onto any recruits who match that allegiance. Instead of placing or retrieving workers, there is 1/3 option that a player can do on his or her turn, but this is limited to once per player per game. This option is resolving the ethical dilemma. Flip the help card over to the ethical dilemma side. spend the artifacts shown in the top box or any 2 other artifact cards, and then make a choice between the left side or the right side. If you choose the right side, immediately place one of your stars on the card. If you choose the left side, you don't place a star. Instead, you draw 2 new recruit cards, look at them, and choose one to keep. Then check the allegiance of that recruit. If either on the allegiance track or the tunnel track, those recruits are already revealed on the face-up side, immediately place the recruit face up. If that type of recruit has not yet been revealed, place it face down. If the recruit has been revealed and has reached the end of the allegiance track, you may be able to even immediately place a star on it. Once this new recruit has been revealed, you will be able to use that recruit's ability. In addition to their allegiance and the possibility of earning a star, each of your recruits comes with a special ability, which makes one of the other actions in the game more powerful, either by making it cheaper or giving you the option to spend an extra cost to gain some extra benefit. Note that you must be able to pay the full cost of one of your recruit's abilities in order to take the action. For example, this one here requires you to gain 2 knowledge, which the player is not capable of doing, and therefore the player could not take that action. As distinct from these action spaces on the board, where the player can still take the action even if he or she cannot go further up the knowledge track. Players cannot use the abilities of their face-down recruit cards. Once a player places his or her 10th star, the game ends immediately, and the player who placed the 10th star wins. It is possible for multiple players to place their 10th star at the same time, either by completion of a market or completion of an allegiance track. When this happens, resolve ties in the following order. First, look for the player with the highest morale. If still tied, the player with the lowest knowledge. Then, the player who has the most stars on markets. Then, the player who has the most territories with their stars in it. And finally, roll all of your dice that are active, not the ones in the worker pool, and lowest score wins. And that's how to play Euphoria. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you enjoy playing. Please subscribe to our channel if you'd like to hear more from Meeple University.